Today we're excited to welcome Michael Tomlinson, CEO of BDI, sitting down for an engaging conversation with John Ashmen, President of Citygate Network. John came to his post as CEO at Citygate Network in 2007 from the Christian Camp and Conference Association, where he served for 15 years as VP and Chief Operating Officer. The combination of these two positions has given John a career of almost 30 years in association management. John holds a Bachelor of Science in Bible with a social work emphasis and a Master of Organizational Management. He's the author of Invisible Neighbors, a how-to for Christians who are serious about meaningful engagement with the poor. He also serves as a committee member with the Circle of Protection and on the board of the National Association of Evangelicals. BDI CEO Michael Tomlinson, belovedly known as MT, will be sitting down with John to talk about the social and political landscape for faith-first organizations and particularly rescue missions in the context of year 2 of the pandemic, and also share about Citygate's role in the nation's capital. As we invite MT and John to join us in just a minute, I want to invite you to submit your questions for them in the chat bar along the right-hand side of your screen. We will not have time, not enough time anyway, to address live questions during the course of this webinar, but we'll be responding later in the webinar group on the left-hand side of the page. If you have a few more moments, we want to encourage you to visit with your colleagues there for a more informal conversation and some great networking. On the left-hand side of the homepage, you'll find our groups. I encourage you to join in on these conversations and use these groups to connect with other professionals at any time. Okay, let's jump in with MT visiting with John Ashmen.
Thank you so much, Lolly. Boy, it is my privilege today to be with John Ashmen, President and CEO of Citygate Network. Welcome, John.
Thanks. Great to be back in Monrovia.
We're going to cover a lot of things today about the Citygate, about COVID, and about what we're seeing in missions. But before we do that, let's start at a 40,000 foot and talk about the Citygate Network, what it is, and talk a little bit about the services and the mission of the network.
Well, Citygate Network has been around since 1906 in one form or another. It started as the National Federation of Gospel Missions. Federation is something where a lot of people come together and they may not agree with one another, but they need each other to get great deals or to work with government. And that's what happened back in 1906. The Salvation Army was actually part of the Federation back then. In 1913, it became the International Union of Gospel Missions. And then in 2000, it became the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. And we rebranded in 2018 as Citygate Network. So what we do, essentially we provide education, training, and resources for the people who run rescue missions and similar ministries. What we say is nobody ever trains anybody how to run a mission. You end up running a hotel because you sleep people. You run a restaurant because you feed people. You run a church. You run a school. You do buildings and grounds, public relations, government relations. And when you get people who come into a ministry from a ministry background, they might not know a lot about business administration.
Right.
And people who come in from a business background and they don't understand ministry concepts. So we are the gathering place for all of these people to come to find out and what's going on these days and answer their questions. What do you do about? Who else is doing? Where can we find? What does the government mean when they say? So that's pretty much the purpose of Citygate Network. It is, again, to use that term, the gathering place of people running missions and similar ministries helping the hungry, homeless, abused, and addicted.
Right. John, I know that our partners tend to use Citygate Network for two main areas. One is education, as you described, and the other is this idea of fellowship with other members.
Yeah.
Let's start with the education. If you go through Citygate's website and the welcome kit that it comes with new membership, it covers, 70, 80 member benefits. Talk about some of those.
Well, I'll have to go back and find out where those extra 10 are. 65, thereabouts, is I think what we're up to. But we look at member benefits as a salad bar. There are people who go to some of the main ingredients, like let's go get the iceberg lettuce, let's go get the spinach, whatever it may be. Very few people prefer to have the Harvard beets at the one end or the cucumber tips at the other end. But what we find out is that there's something for everybody within the association. We basically have that many services for critical mass. Right. But what we find most frequently is that the fellowship is always number one, the networking. We have great seminars. At one of our annual conferences, we generally have about 75 seminars. But people take those seminar lists and they go to their boss and say, I need to go to the annual conference and exposition this year. Look at all the seminars. And what we often find is they're outside of the seminar room talking, getting ideas, bouncing things back and forth. And then they go and get the recordings of all the seminar, listen to them on the plane going home so they can make up for the reason that they actually went.
That's awesome. Clearly, the scope of engagement of Citygate Network is really broad. Two things that I find completely indispensable, John. One is the bi-monthly newsletter. Tell me about that.
You're referring to Street Smart.
Indeed.
Okay, that's what we put out via email, and it has information about what's going on within the association. We talk about individual missions and sometimes CEOs or staff in a section called Looking Down the Street. And then we have information about what's going on nationally. We have a Canadian section. We have facts and figures. There's job ads, opportunities there, and a devotional. And that's well received. So that is one of the favorites.
Indeed. And monthly, we've been getting updates about COVID over the last year and a half. Now, speaking personally, one of the biggest challenges for me last year wasn't just migrating our business model to serve our partners in the field, but it was to navigate the media and to navigate news and truth and to find out what's going on. Citygate was an incredible resource in weeding out the noise from the truth. Tell me about what it was like to occupy that role for your members.
When COVID-19 became big news, that week we were in Secretary Carson's 10th floor meeting room in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We had 150 members there. And what happened that week as we were going through all of our meetings, the last day of those meetings, we send people over to the Senate office buildings, the House office buildings. And that last day, people were coming to us and saying, yeah, we had a great meeting with our senator or our representative, but they were packing up, they were leaving. And one day later, everybody was on planes out of DC to go home, and we kind of sealed up at that point. But Citygate Network started early. In January, we started putting things on our website. We developed a coronavirus webpage and started putting out information that we were gathering. And then a couple of days later, I was asked to be on the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness COVID-19 task force. On that task force was HHS and HUD, people from the CDC. We had the White House on there. We had Salvation Army and the Red Cross. And we would meet 3 times a week, and then that turned out to be 2 times a week. And then by the time we got down to October, it was once a week. But we were discussing all of the issues out there and trying to see what we could do to save lives and protect the hospital system.
Yes.
The reason was, back in those March dates, there were people on the White House task force who were saying we probably would see between 10 and 20,000 people who are homeless die because of COVID-19. And when you think about it, it would make sense because you have immune deficiencies of people who live on the street. They sometimes are in unhealthy areas. They gather together often in parks and things like that. And so that was the big concern. So we, as well as Salvation Army and Family Promise and some others, jumped on this and started working together, working with the CDC, working with USICH. And every week we would talk about what we're doing. We collaborate together. I was on the phone with people from Salvation Army and Family Promise and Catholic Charities, St. Vincent de Paul on a regular basis. How are you doing? Together, working to make this an environment that was safe for homeless people.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough on behalf of our organization and your other members. It was so important to know that there was advocacy in Washington, D.C. I think it's easy to forget a year later that no one was prepared for what the world was going to roll out. We didn't know how deep, how long, how wide, or what the impact was going to be. And I'll say this, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, Citygate Network, and yourself in particular, never flinched. You kept the well-being as a support organization, as a membership, keeping your family together with information that was timely and that had access that none of us had. That's one of the things I don't think many fully understand about Citygate Network is that the network is actually an advocate in Washington, D.C. for missions and mission organizations. Yeah. And you are not only a witness to what's happening from a trend standpoint, but you're actually a participant in representing our voice in Washington, D.C. Isn't that right?
We are, and there's a lot of offices where we work. This collaboration that we had with this USICH task force, it really paid off because remember that 10 to 20,000 deaths that were predicted?
Sure.
There were a lot of factors why there weren't that many, and most people never got the news. It was never reported how many deaths there really were in the homeless community, both sheltered and unsheltered. It was less than 300.
Isn't that a miracle?
It is. There's a lot of reasons for that. You know, homeless people self-quarantine.
Sure.
While they do get together from time to time, there's also stay away from my tent or I'll kill you. You know, that kind of thing that goes on out there. And then you have people who during the summer were outside a lot and UV rays help kill the virus. But inside the congregant settings, which a lot of people oppose, that there's so many advocates who were against what missions and places like that were doing, and saying congregant settings are terrible. This is a good time to get rid of them. They were looking around and saying something's going on in here, and it's not really going the direction we were thinking it was going. And so what you ended up having was very good sanitation. PPE, as personal protection equipment, was circulated, and then anytime the CDC would come out with something new, we were there to let people know what it was within 3 hours of a new release of information.
Were you surprised at how responsive? I know that the heroism of our rescue mission compatriots, it doesn't surprise us because it comes from a cause-oriented desire to serve and a dedication to changing lives, life transformation in that ministry, but in a period that was completely without precedent, where there was mortal danger to all. Were you at all surprised by how flexible many independent rescue missions were able to be in order to bob and weave and to continue to serve despite the really challenging environment?
Well, you're right, MT. Mission people are the real heroes, those in the trenches. When COVID-19 swept across the country, what we saw was a huge influx to missions that were many already operating at capacity. You had prisons opening their doors, sending people out. Where are they going to go? A mission. True. And young kids showing up at a mission saying, Dad lost his job. There's no food in the house. Mom said, come down to the mission and they'll feed you. And then you had those who were sleeping rough and decided this thing may be dangerous. I better go indoors, and they go to the mission. Well, greater influx, and at the same time, a CEO at a mission is looking around and say, which of my staff do I have to send home because they're over age or because their immune system is not up to par, and which volunteers can come in. So you have greater need, fewer personnel, and then you're told to reduce the number of beds. Right. And so that was what missions were dealing with. And then take a look at the 24-hour care that's needed in these situations. So many people were working around the clock. So if you want to find real heroes during COVID-19, it's the people who are running rescue missions and similar ministries.
Isn't that the truth? And isn't it just like people of faith to show up when the times require it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to pivot here for a second. Let's talk a little bit about a conversation that you've had with the Citygate Network membership about crisis relief versus life transformation ministry. Let's talk a little bit about how those differ and how they play together.
Well, let me back up a little further than even that. I've said for quite some time there are 4 ways that people, Christian ministry leaders, or even the world in general, tries to help people who are struggling. We call it human suffering. We want to get people from suffering to flourishing. Right. And the 4 ways that we do that, the first way is humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is when you fly in with the big C-5 planes and drop off bags of rice, or you drill wells, or you take doctors and nurses to a place where there's an outbreak. Right. And when you've got things under control, the water's flowing, people are being fed, they leave, or they should, sometimes they don't, and then people are on their way back to flourishing. So that is humanitarian aid. The second way is community development. Community development is what Shane Claiborne and some of those people have made popular with their style of ministry. I'm 27, my spouse is 25. I've got a 2-year-old and one on the way, and we're moving into the middle of Camden, New Jersey, or East St. Louis, or whatever the town happens to be. And we're going to work within our own city block, and we're going to get to know the people. We're going to develop cottage industries. We're going to work with the school system. We're going to have great parks. And in the process, you start bringing more folks around, and you develop the community block at a time. The third way is disaster relief. Disaster relief comes after a flood, a fire, a hurricane, an earthquake, or a tornado.
Pandemic.
There you go. And in many cases, you've seen the pictures. Texas, people floating down the bayou on the roof of their car, and they get evacuated maybe by the National Guard, and they're taken to a gymnasium where the Salvation Army or the Red Cross are waiting. They're put on cots. Their food is brought into them. They get new clothing, and that's day after day. They're fed, clothed, sheltered, until maybe Habitat for Humanity comes in and helps them rebuild their home, and then they have moved from human suffering to human flourishing. The fourth way we try to move people from human suffering to human flourishing is through life transformation. What's life transformation? Well, let's say somebody's under a bridge, they haven't eaten in 2 days, it's below freezing, and those people who are chasing him or her for the shoes they're wearing know where he or she is.
Right.
There comes the mission van. They're thinking they may not survive the night, but now there's an opportunity. They're taken to the mission. They're able to be fed, clothed, sheltered. They find out there's education opportunities, there's job placement opportunities, housing opportunities, on and on. And that is what life transformation is. Here's the problem. We had so many missions that were doing disaster relief in place of life transformation, just because that's how missions started. When I say they were doing disaster relief, that means they were doing the food, clothing, shelter over and over again every night, often for the same people who had no desire to change, but they kept seeing the mission as their pantry, their kitchen, their bedroom, their closet, and it was comfortable. We are seeing so many of our organizations say, having this disaster relief thing going on and on every night without an exit strategy for these people is wrong, maybe even evil. What we need to do is look at the life transformation portion, and that's why we've saying, yes, what you're doing in the food, clothing, shelter, that's important. That is the entryway into the life transformation process. But you can't stay there doing disaster relief night after night. Life transformation looks a lot different.
John, that sounds very much like the 8 S's that you talk about at Citygate
Yes, yeah. In fact, on the DC forum that you mentioned earlier, Congressman Tom Suozzi said, I was on your website, I love these 8 S's. And I felt like saying, bring that to the floor of the House. Let's get the whole House to vote on it. Right. But the 8 S's really kind of tell the story to our members of what needs to happen in life transformation. The first S is saved. What we mean by saved is saving a life. Some people may think, well, you're a rescue mission, we know the chapel service and making a spiritual decision. Spiritual regeneration can happen in any of the 8 S's. But this first S, save, means when somebody's about ready to overdose and you've taken the needle away, you've saved a life. You throw open the door from a girl who's running away from her pimp and you slam it behind her before he can catch up, you've saved a life. When you work with a family who has children whose brain and body development aren't where they need to be because of poor nutrition, you saved a life. The next S is sober, no longer controlled by stimulants or depressants. The next S is stable. That has to do with mental health or physical health. For years, rescue missions didn't really pay attention to the mental health of people. I was at one mission, I remember, and talking to the CEO, and he was showing me how many people were coming in for lunch, and I pointed to a particular person and said, what's the story with this guy over here who's talking to himself? And, oh, that's Fred, he's harmless. I said, but has anybody ever done a mental health assessment there? And he kind of scratched his head and said, oh, I guess we haven't. And we've been talking about that for such a long time that people started asking that same question and started partnering with mental health clinics in their city. Now we have about 30% of our members who actually have mental health clinics in their buildings, right, which is just wonderful to see.
One of the things I heard at the forum was that 75% of those in rescue missions have mental health issues of some sort or another.
Right. Numbers are 73, 4, 5%, something like that with mental health. And it's like 1 or 2 points less for addictions, 71, 2, 3, 4% that have an addiction. So those are significant. So that's why the sober and the stable are so important. Mm-hmm. The next S is schooled. That means you have enough education to be competitive. It could be completing your high school degree. It could be social skills, but it's education to get you out there on the street so that you are working with those side by side and they understand that you know what's going on around you and in the world. The next S is skilled. And what we mean by skilled is employment. Missions try to put people in jobs, and I keep reminding them that a job is parking cars, a job is flipping burgers, a job is bussing tables, and if you just have jobs, you kind of get bored with what you're doing, and you kind of get back in the same old circles. What we're talking about is careers. How do you give somebody the desire to do something, to create something, to work in an area? And so when you can develop careers for people, that keeps them on the job path for a long time. The next S is secure. That means you're getting paid for the job that you have, the career that you're involved in, and you're getting enough money. You know how to manage it because schooled was involved, and you maybe are getting enough money in to bring your family back in living with you. The next S is settled. That means you have your own safe place to stay every night. And the last S is serving. That means you're giving back to the community, involved in missional living. So those are the 8 S's of life transformation, and it's making a huge difference in so many of our member organizations.
And we see that life transformation when you walk into missions. You see that in different progressions from whom you meet in there. Mm-hmm. I think that this is an incredibly important topic when we think of getting the support from the community for missions and getting the message about life transformation out there. I have the opportunity to serve on the Giving Institute that looks at philanthropy across all segments of nonprofits. And one of the things we saw in the COVID season was a true era of feast or famine. Nonprofits that served on the front lines, like rescue missions, that told their message well, benefited from having the support of the community. But more than likely, they saw a buoyed giving because of the knowledge of the disaster relief and crisis relief. But the question becomes, how do we engage them in the benefits of life transformation at the missions so that support continues over time? How do you help rescue missions understand the value of promoting the life transformation versus sitting in the narrative that's more familiar with meals and shelter?
Well, the first thing we do is work with those organizations who are only doing food, clothing, and shelter, and maybe an addiction recovery program, and say, if that's all God has called you to do, that's fine. Keep doing it, but you need to be working with organizations that are doing those other 8 S words in order to complete the process for these people of going from human suffering to human flourishing.
Sure.
The second thing we're trying to do is help people understand the importance of outcome statistics. Outcome statistics measure results. We've been really good at measuring output statistics as faith-based organizations. Even churches, how many people come to Sunday school, how many hands are raised after the invitation. Christian camps, how many people came down to the fire after the pastor made an invitation and they walked through the sawdust, and those are the things that we report to our members. In missions, we do it. How many nights of lodging, how many meals we serve. Well, that's wonderful, and people give to that because, again, it measures need, and output measures need. Outcome, again, measures results, and it's the major donors, it's the foundations, it's the future. They want to see what the outcome is, what the results are. One of the places that's so important for us to get this is in response to what the government says is the only solution for homelessness, and that is housing first. They will say, we go with housing first because it's an evidence-based solution. Well, where's the evidence that someone going through a faith-based addiction recovery program is better off than if they went through just an addiction recovery program on the street somewhere or with some organization that is not faith-based? We really don't have that because we've never measured outcomes as an institution. And so it's time to start doing that. So in the days ahead, that's going to be one of the biggest things within Citygate Network is measuring how many people who went through an addiction recovery program are clean and sober 2 years later? How many people who got placed in a job are still working 18 months later? How many people who have made a commitment to Christ are still living in Christian community 2 years later, 3 years later, whatever the case may be?
I think this is incredibly important, both on a national level and a local level, because one of the criticisms that the general public often has about a rescue mission is that their capacity is only to help as far as they can throw a stone, opposed to a more nationally branded outcomes, oriented solution to a national problem like homelessness. Again, another one of the important reasons of being part of a membership that's working together to serve as the aggregator of some of this data so that we can put apples to apples before the public, and the public can choose from the court of public opinion and with their dollars whom to support.
Indeed, yes, that's the great way to look at it.
John, one of the discussions at the DC Forum that really struck me as being important, because it requires lead time and work ahead of the game, is that missions need to be developing relationships with their local and federal governors and those that are advocates and represent them in Washington, D.C. Not something that you can do overnight when you need it. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, one of the things we say right off the bat is make sure you have these relationships with your state lawmakers, your federal lawmakers, early. Invite them to your organization. Don't wait till there's a crisis with some new legislation coming out that you're concerned about, and then you try to find out who they are and who the people are in their office. You need to know who the LAs are, the LDs are early on, and have relationships with them. That should be done now, and invite them to your property. So many politicians love to have a photo op at a mission when they're back on their home territory, and your place is a great place to have this kind of exposure.
I think it's a really interesting point because some will feel intimidated by calling up their governor or their senator or their congressman and inviting them to their place of business. But there's something in it for them, isn't there?
Oh, of course. And they love to show their constituents that they're engaged and involved with what missions are doing.
And when they see those people, when they see their constituents, not just the ones that are on their donor list, but the ones that are suffering in the communities that they represent in Washington, D.C., I think it transforms their heart. It changes the way that they feel about gospel rescue missions.
Well, it goes even further than that. I was with someone from a particular state who's in public office in D.C., and they were having a great time kind of meeting those folks who were coming through the food line, and all of a sudden they stopped and started asking questions to one of the gentlemen, and it turns out that they went to high school together. The politician and this person in the mission getting a meal. And when that relationship kind of was relived in the mind of the politician, he sat down and said, it just never hit me that the people who are coming through a mission are people that I might know. Sure. They're always objectified, the homeless, the needy, the poor out there, and we don't kind of identify with them unless all of a sudden we have that experience where you say, I know this guy.
That's right. One of the things that I'm noticing is the changing face of homelessness. When I was a kid, there was a prototypical person that you would expect to find in a rescue mission. It was generally a white male with addiction problems or employment problems. And that's not who we're seeing today. We're seeing younger families, single families, broken families. We're seeing grandma and grandpa who were economically forced out of their housing situation. Again, so important that life transformation become a big part of what missions are doing in addition to feeding and sheltering.
The one thing that I'm telling people to watch out for is the elderly homeless, which is coming on fast. You know that the typical baby boomer has $152,000 saved for retirement. Total. And so maybe they're getting Social Security, but you add that together and kind of average it on their life expectancy. And if they have an apartment in New York City or in Los Angeles, they're going to be in trouble in just a year or two. And so what are we going to do with all these elderly homeless in the days ahead? That's something where we need to be spending a lot of our time.
I agree. There are many things that we need to be concerned about, both in the shadow of COVID and in philanthropy moving forward. John, let me pivot to one of the large challenges that garner, understandably, a lot of conversations in missions and in Christian nonprofits today, and that's the Equality Act. Can you help us understand it, a little bit of its history, what you expect to see here in the near future, and how that might transform how we do what we do?
Well, at Citygate Network, we've been looking at the Equality Act, or the seeds of it, since 2014 or 2015. I remember we had our annual conference in 2014 in St. Louis. Our attorney, John Rublin, and I did a session on LGBTQ issues, and we said at some point that we're going to have to ask this question: does religious rights take precedent over human rights, or vice versa? And that's where we are today. So the Equality Act, it passed in the House in 2019. It was widely symbolic at that point. A huge number of representatives co-sponsored the bill, but we knew it would not go anywhere in the Senate, and it just sat there. Now that there is a Democrat majority in the Senate, it is up for consideration. And because President Biden has promised that it would be passed in the first 100 days, there are people working hard to see that happens. Well, this is a big problem for faith organizations or anybody of faith, because it says, we know the answer to that 2014 question: human rights have priority over religious rights. See, the equality kind of guts the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 that Bill Clinton signed, and I think it was, like 98 senators voted for. And so we are now at that point where we're looking to reverse that. Ryan Tucker's an attorney with the Alliance Defending Freedom, and he said, rescue missions are like the final exam in law school for this Equality Act. It affects missions and similar ministries in so many areas. First of all, your accommodations, who can sleep where. It affects hiring, who you can hire. It affects all the things having to do with the youth camps that many of our missions have, or they send people to in the summer, athletics in those areas, what you teach. One of the things that is out there right now is this question about, well, maybe we should divide up the people who are in a ministry and say there's a ministerial position and then there's just general operations. So that means you have to look around and say who really is interacting with our people in a ministry capacity, and it's okay if they hold their deeply held religious convictions. But if somebody's driving the van to pick up clothing for the thrift store, or they're in operations, maybe they're a security guard, maybe they're clerical staff, that's not a ministerial position. So you can't say that that person in that role has to be somebody who agrees with your statement of faith or your statement of life conduct. And so that's going to cause a lot of problems. Senator James Langford from Oklahoma was talking the other day on the floor of the House, and one of the things he said was, if you apply for a job and maybe you're gay and you suspect that you weren't hired because you were gay, you can bring suit against that organization. Well, here's the difference of what the Equality Act will bring to this equation. If you are a faith-based organization and you have written out your tenets, tied them to Scripture, and have got them approved by your board of directors, right, you basically have a religious defense in any of the situations we're talking about. The Equality Act gets rid of that. There is no religious defense. And so now, if someone says, I suspect that you didn't hire me because I'm bisexual or I'm transgender or whatever it is, they can bring suit, and you are basically uncovered in the middle of this.
Yeah, and often the accusation is as damaging as the truth in any of those senses.
Yeah. The Equality Act will also impact counseling and teaching, preaching, whatever. If it's casting aspersions on an alternate lifestyle, it's taboo. But let me interrupt myself here and just say, in Citygate Network, we don't believe somebody should lose their house or lose their job because of sexual orientation or gender identity. We don't believe you should be thrown off a jury because of sexual orientation or gender identity. But we do believe that as a Christian organization, you have the right to hire according to your deeply held spiritual convictions. Right. And I want to be clear, these are not just beliefs. When you talk to Alliance Defending Freedom, you talk to the Beckett Fund and others who are providing defense for a lot of cases that are in the news right now, there is a big difference between a belief and a deeply held spiritual conviction. That's what we have, and that's why we say this is important to protect.
It's going to be really important in the days to come that we be in prayer of this issue because it is so polarizing. Even as you step into rescue missions and speak with leadership, some feel very, very differently about it. We were talking about kind of three responses to it, some preemptive, some predictive, and some more collaborative with that. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, what we've seen in the past, and things may change if the pressure is really on. Sure. But what we've seen in the past is the first response is, well, we're just not going to be involved in ministry.
Doors closed.
That's what's required. That's what happened in a lot of the adoption agencies back when there were decisions made that you had to allow adoption for same-sex married families. That was the case. The second response is slap the cuffs on, send me to jail. I don't care. Fine us, whatever. We're going to hold to our beliefs and keep taking our ministry forward. Pretty soon you're going to run out of money and you're going to run out of staff because they're behind bars if that's the case. The last response is, hey, we live in a world where things change and we are going to be content to move forward and living in a world where we don't like the laws, we don't understand the values, but we are going to serve Christ this way.
We still have to serve.
And people are going to have to make this decision of which camp they're in.
Right. What advice would you have for mission leadership that is struggling with, A, trying to understand the Equality Act, B, know what's happening with it in terms of passing or becoming law, C, what the community thinks about it, and D, questions that they're getting from their staff?
Well, the first thing I would say is keep watching Citygate Network because we're talking about this regularly in Street Smart, in publications that I put out. We'll have webinars out about it. We don't know what's going to happen. It could be a couple of months before this is up for a vote. It could be attached to another bill or portions of it. There could be some kind of compromise. But whatever is going to happen, it's going to be a sea change for a lot of faith-based organizations. I would tell people who are watching this to contact your senators. It's already passed in the House. Another version of it may go back to the House at some point. But the senators right now are the ones who need to have all of the input from people who are working in missions or any ministry. Just people who say, yes, I have deeply held spiritual convictions that God ordained marriage as a sacred covenant between one man and one woman, and that he made two very distinct sexes. And I am going to hold to that. And Mr. Senator, Mrs. Senator, here's my position, and here's how I would like you to vote on this.
Right. Being in the faith space, John, I think some might assume that the Citygate Network has one political party affiliation or another, but you make it very clear that that isn't the case.
Absolutely. We've worked in my tenure with the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now with the Biden administration. What we're seeing, there's a lot of people who are one-issue voters. Maybe they'll vote with abortion issues in mind clearly, or maybe it has to do with LGBTQ issues, or maybe it has to do with the Equality Act that we're talking about. Maybe it has to do with immigration, whatever it is. And they have kind of turned elections. We look at all of those and decide that we're going to have to step through this very carefully, like a minefield. But we work with Republicans and Democrats. One of the things that came across to us in the responses to the DC forum that we had was, wow, you had a lot of connections during the Trump administration and people working in high positions. But it seems like you have a lot of connections now in the Biden administration. I had lunch the other day with Josh Dixon, who's now the Deputy Director of the White House Office on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. There are a lot of senators we know. We know a lot of the people who are being appointed to positions. Josh's boss is Melissa Rogers. She was in the faith-based office under the Obama administration, and we worked with her then. So there's a great team out there. Ben Odell has come over from HHS. We've got a lot of friends in this administration. And, Democrat, Republican, it just depends on what the issues are of how we work with them. What we find is that the Democrats love what we do. When I say we, what missions do, they just don't understand why missions don't take government money to do it. The Republicans, they understand the motivation. Sometimes they just don't understand poverty real well. And so that's why we've been asked many times to be involved with the Republican Study Committee to help them understand the issues.
I agree, John. I think the Equality Act may be the issue of the day, whereas we thought perhaps the biggest challenge in the years to come will be migrating out of a pandemic season and back into the real world once again. The very fundamental services that we offer may be impacted by this.
Well, the Equality Act in some form will pass at some point.
Right.
We can count on that. But what we know is that we live in a world with many problems, many concerns, many issues. And what I tell folks is when it comes to LGBTQ issues, unless you have tears in your eyes when you talk about this, you probably shouldn't be talking about it. Mm-hmm. We have to understand all of the people who are out there and the problems that have happened and how we as Christians really probably haven't been sensitive to those issues for decades and decades. And now as we kind of face them going forward, we face them in a little bit of angst and anger. And I'm saying every person is made in God's image and needs love. And we have to be representatives of Jesus going forward to love these people. And again, going back to what I said before, everybody has basic human rights and they should be cared for. We still feel that we have rights as religious organizations to carry out our mission in a way that protects our deeply held spiritual convictions. So somewhere we have to find middle ground on this. But even so, we have to serve with love.
Indeed, indeed. That's a great transition to what I love to talk about, which are bright spots. I am unbelievably blessed to be on the front lines with many of our mission partners, as I know you are. Mm-hmm. And what we get a chance to see from a heroism standpoint on the front lines, from a life transformation standpoint, from a cultural standpoint is really, really encouraging. I'm going to give some, but I'd love to hear what are some of the bright spots that you see in mission life, in mission ministry, and in the areas that we serve.
One of the things that's coming out loud and clear as we talk to members is that they have seen just a whole new wave of spiritual decisions over the last year. People coming in because of fear, because of COVID. People spending more time in a mission because of COVID, as opposed to just coming in at 4 o'clock and getting a meal and getting a bed and being out by 7 o'clock. There's a lot of 24/7 care that's happening these days. Well, when you have 24/7 care or you're in the company of leaders from missions, there's a lot more time for that fellowship and connection. And so there's a lot more discipleship going on, and there's a lot more people coming to Christ or bringing their problems to the Lord in a way where there's constant supervision, but also constant collaboration with ideas from all of the mission staff. And so that's one of the things that we're hearing so many times, that God is working in amazing ways in missions in 2020 and 2021 now.
Yeah, I'm blown away by the innovation that I see. Missions that may have been doing the services that they've been doing for years and years and years, maybe with generations of staff that have come to think of the way that their ministry works, completely taking out on a blank sheet of paper, starting with compassion, thinking of life transformation, and having the courage to fill in the gaps in between with the tools, the different tools that are available today, and with a new knowledge.
One of the things that we saw in our survey of members when we were trying to get the number of beds that are available for USICH back, maybe this was April or May of 2020, was the number of shelter beds in missions has actually gone down. The number of program beds has actually gone up. This kind of indicates to us that 8 S's of life transformation are really taking place, and people are saying, I really do want to be involved in this life transformation. This is where I need to spend my time.
Another bright spot that's incredibly encouraging to me, because I have millennial children, is seeing the next generation catch the vision and the passion for compassion at the community level. Thinking about volunteerism, thinking about donating, and being very discerning about whom they want to support and why they want to support them. They're looking for 360. They're looking for life change in that. And that's a great challenge for missions that have perhaps measured their outcomes with meals and beds alone. Not that those aren't important, they are. But that may not be the first area that the next generation connects with.
Yeah, the next generation, certainly millennials, want to see those outcomes. Previous generations love the outputs. That's, again, that measures need, and we'll give to that because we love all this volume of work that you're doing. But the changed life is really what's important, and people are saying, I don't want to keep giving money to an organization that is asking for donations month after month after month to feed the same people. This is like a car payment that never ends.
Right.
What are we going to do to say we don't have to do this as much anymore because these people have now had a changed life and they are now giving back to society, and there's more people who have gone through this process and also giving back to society, and it's really turning the tide in our city.
Speaking of the next generation, I heard a really interesting statistic at the forum, with regards to the transition in leadership in the coming season, the natural working up of leadership and management in missions, and the natural transition out of some senior leadership. It's interesting how that comes in waves, but a wave is coming, isn't that right?
It is. We did a major survey in July of 2020, and 200 questions, something like that. And we came away with 12 really significant issues that we flagged for our board, and then we're passing on to our members. The one you're talking about was that 39% of our CEOs say they're going to retire in the next 5 years.
Wow.
And there's a pretty good wave of them going to retire in the next 2 years. And so with that being the case, you have to look at who's coming behind for this organization. One of the things that I've always been concerned about is, we keep leading in the style that we've always led. We turn around to hand that baton off to somebody. There may not be anybody back there who wants it because we have not led the organization in a direction that millennial leaders want it to go. And so we have to bring on more younger people to our boards, more in our staff, these people that you're talking about who have this passion, who can help shape the direction for the future.
Yeah. John, one of the things you and I talked about was, in addition to all of the efficiencies that we're seeing technology bring us, that there are some harbingers that we need to be careful about in the season to come. Ministry is about relationship, and so much of it can't be done by the pound. Share with me some of your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I think one of the key issues is technology and meetings and events. I've heard some ministries in Colorado Springs, and we have a lot of them headquartered there. We're not going to go back to face-to-face meetings. It's so much easier and so much more efficient, cost-effective if we just do things by Zoom. And I'm going to say, give it a couple of years. You're going to be tired of this. People are going to be tired of this. You read any of the articles about Zoom meetings, what % of the people participate fully, how many people are multitasking while it's going on. God made people for fellowship, and what we see when you walk the halls of one of our events, whether it be the CEO Summit or whether it be the annual conference, is people making major decisions at a discussion with 4 or 5 other leaders, at a coffee table. Or you have these conversations in an elevator, or taking late night walks down to the old town or whatever it may be. That's the connections that are important. You can't get that on Zoom. Even if you do little breakouts, you kind of distracted, interrupted. We're going to go back to meetings. People need that. Another thing that I think COVID did that caused us to do a course correction, and we're going to have to change, is getting back together in offices. I heard a statistic, I don't know how old it is now, but 71% of the offices in New York City were unoccupied at one point a few months ago. There's a lot of empty offices. There are places where people are working from home, and again, I hear, this is good, we're going to keep doing this. And again, I say, give it a few years. I think we're going to look at that and say the efficiency has disappeared. The synergy isn't there anymore. When you're in ministry, you want to be together. You want to be around the table. You want to be discussing things. You want to call down the hall to somebody when you've got an idea. You just can't do that on Slack. You can't do it on Teams. You can't do it by the phone even. And I think we're all going to want to get back together.
Well, and you can't do that at rescue missions.
That's exactly right.
It's a ministry of presence, and that really brings me to probably my greatest bright spot of the COVID season, is seeing this crisis bring people together, truly, organizationally, generationally, and in the community. People truly coming together with faith, coming together with love, coming together when it mattered, being friends and collaborators. in life transformation.
Yeah. You don't want to say it, but COVID was a good thing in that it caused us to rethink what we're doing.
That's right.
And I believe we'll look back in 3 or 4 years and say, when we made that major change because of COVID, that got us on a track to go this direction where we are right now, and look at the spiritual harvest that we've had because of it. I think that's what's in store for us in the days ahead. We just have to be willing to walk that path where we're now heading probably in a different direction than we would have been had there not been COVID, and say, Lord, teach us from this where we need to be in the days ahead.
Yeah, we have to have the courage to say, this started something in us. Let's keep that fire burning.
Yeah, indeed.
John, this has been such a blessing for me because it helps me not only remember all the benefits of the Citygate Network, but remind me that we need to stay very, very lanyard to you as an information source as we look at what happens with the Equality Act and as we navigate the season ahead for missions. Thank you. You know, most of our partners are members, but for those that aren't, what would you say to them to encourage them to join?
Well, just take a look at what's offered out there. You may not like the salad bar at one end or another, and maybe you're not a collaborator as a CEO, but think of your downline staff. If you're not, you probably hired people who were because you needed to make up that difference in your organizational personality. They need people. They need to connect with others as well. One of the things that people say, you know, we're in Citygate Network now because we're going through all kinds of storms, and you don't want to be in your own canoe during a storm. You want to be in the big boat. Right. And so that's why we ask people to come in and be part of this. And I just want to say to you, thanks for allowing me to jump in and spend today with you. I love what Brewer Direct has been doing. Your leadership has been tremendous. You guys are creative here, and that's one of the things that we need in the days ahead. Flexibility and creativity, and Brewer Direct has been known for that. So thanks for your good work.
I could not say it better. John, we respect you. We thank you. God bless you and your team at Citygate Network.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, John and MT, for that great session. I see a number of comments and questions have come through on the chat below. Unfortunately, we'll not have time to answer them live, but we will get answers to your questions from MT and John and post them on the homepage of our virtual community. We invite you to continue the conversation by joining the webinar group on the left-hand side of the page. Next month, we'll be featuring a pithy webinar on rebranding. If you can join us, please go ahead and register on the events page, and we'll see you there. We invite you to share your feedback on today's webinar on the homepage of the community, and please also share any specific topics that you'd like to hear coming up. We hope you've been enjoying connecting, networking, and sharing with one another, and we'll see you next time.